lot of the home renovations work, which does get done, tends to be concentrated on houses which are in the kind of 30 to 35 year age group. There was actually a bit of a building boom for detached houses in the late 1980s and it lasted up until the early 1990s recession kicked off. Now, a lot of those homes which were built at that point are now becoming prime and ripe for major renovations works.
Welcome to Building Perspective, the Master Builders SA podcast. I'm your host, Will Frogley. Join me as I speak with some characters in the building and construction industry.
How did CBUS become a top-performing super fund? By returning an average of 9.25% every year for the past 37 years. What does that mean? Well, it means we're pretty darn reliable. CBUS, for all of us. To consider if CBUS is right for you, go to cbussuper.com.au for a PDS and target market determination. Past performance is not a reliable indicator of future performance.
Forecasting is difficult at the best of times, but it's been particularly challenging over the past 2 years. So who better to try and sort out the madness than our chief economist from Master Builders, Shane Garrett. Welcome, Shane.
Thanks very much, Will. Thanks for inviting me to partake.
So obviously we've been in, unprecedented times over the past 2 years. It's been an absolute roller coaster for everyone in the industry, whether it's starting point, is there going to be any work, to how do we manage all this work that we've got and prices and shortages. It's really been an incredible run, hasn't it, Shane?
Been an amazing 2 years, Will. I totally agree with you there. Just looking back, we had home building levels in South Australia reach incredibly strong volumes as a result of home builder. If you look at what was expected this time 2 years ago, we were really worried that we would be in a huge recession, a huge downturn, and that there'd be very large drops in activity. But in fact, the opposite has happened, and that's largely thanks to the government's home builder plan. That propelled new home building in South Australia very strongly. Now, South Australia was well placed to benefit from it for a couple of reasons. First of all, we have a very strong detached house content in South Australia compared with other parts of Australia. And that meant that South Australia responded much more effectively to the home builder scheme, which was good. The other feature of the South Australian market, of course, is that there is a substantial regional market in South Australia outside of Adelaide. And one of the things we've seen right across the country as a result of the pandemic is that people are much more willing and able to live in regional areas, and people are much more keen to live in a house rather than an apartment or something more high density. And I think those two realities have been in the favour of South Australia's building industry over the last 2 years. That's the last 2 years. Looking forward, the strong level of activity that we have seen, some of that is sort of borrowed from the future. So in other words, what we are expecting and what we're seeing when we look at building approvals is that the number of new detached house projects getting off the ground now is falling back quite quickly, but that's not to be expected. That's a fairly predictable development given that we've had such a record amount of activity over the past 18 months. But I think the omens are pretty good over the more medium term. Our latest set of forecasts, they go out to 2025, 2026 financial year, about 4 or 5 years from now. And we're expecting that South Australia, once it kind of navigates the downturn that's currently underway, once that's actually over and out of the way, South Australia will be placed quite well to see quite strong levels of new house building over that period up to the middle of the decade. And there's a couple of reasons behind that. There's been, as I say, the transformation in people's living and working patterns. So people want more detached houses, and that's good for a detached house heavy market like South Australia. People are also much more keen to live in regional areas. That's going to benefit the smaller towns in SA outside of Adelaide. But what we're also seeing in the SA situation, in the SA context, is that the pandemic has actually strengthened aspects of the labour market in South Australia. It's slowed down a little bit, but if you go back kind of 6 months or a year ago, the amount of job creation in South Australia was doing very, very well. It was going very, very strongly. Why that's so important is because before the pandemic started, people were actually leaking out of South Australia and they were going to live and work in other parts of the country. So a lot of young people, for example, were leaving South Australia to work in places like Melbourne and Sydney. Some were going overseas as well. And the pandemic has brought all of that to an end. And there's a good chance that that change that we saw will become permanent. That means more people sticking around, more people will stay in South Australia to live. And of course, that'll be to the benefit then of demand for new home building, which is exactly what we want to see. I'll switch as well. It's very important not just to talk about new home building, but also to talk about home renovations activity. That's been another big winner. Obviously, big home renovations work was able to receive support out of the home builder scheme, which was brought in about 2 years ago. Home renovations has done very well, not just in South Australia, but in most markets around the country. Again, the future there looks pretty bright. I think that the current supply challenges and the current capacity constraints faced by the building industry, there's evidence, we're hearing evidence that builders find home renovations work a little bit more easy to navigate at the moment. It's something they can juggle around much more easily than they can juggle, say, a large new home building project. Looking down the next few years, we think that the strong increases we've seen in the prices of homes, both in Adelaide and across regional SA, we think that that will actually bolster home renovations work over the next few years. We don't think the home renovations boom, while it's slowing down in the short term, we think that home renovations boom will get a lot of fuel out of the fact that so much home equity has been added to people's balance sheets over the last 2 years. That's one thing. The other thing is quite interesting, actually, because we find that a lot of the home renovations work, which does get done, tends to be concentrated on houses which are in the kind of 30 to 35-year age group. Now, that's important at the moment because luckily, as it happens, a lot of homes, a lot of detached houses were built in South Australia in the late 1980s because there was actually a bit of a building boom for detached houses in the late 1980s and it lasted up until the early 1990s recession kicked off. Now, a lot of those homes which were built at that point are now becoming prime and ripe for major renovations works. And we reckon that a lot of that will happen in the next few years as well. So we think that the future is going to be quite bright on the home renovations front as well. So it's a fairly positive story. We are, as I say, going through a short-term kind of a speed bump when it comes to residential building activity in SA. But we think that that'll be over and done with within a year or a year and a half.
Yeah, Shane, what's been interesting to see in South Australia is, number one, we had such a very high per capita uptake for home builder, and I think the eligibility criteria of the grant played very favourably to our South Australian market here in terms of income caps and the 750 price cap. I think they were, there's a lot that goes a very long way in South Australia compared with the eastern states. There was also a lot of talk about a cliff post home builder, and I think the sales have actually held in there pretty strongly considering. I mean, they've definitely come down, but they've come down from such record highs. If you look at, the figures from comparable months from 2 or 3 years ago, they're still hanging in there pretty well. So I think that's a good sign for the industry. I think a real key for South Australia will be when we can actually get, immigration back and boost that population.
Exactly. And that leads into the whole issue, I suppose, of economic competitiveness. You mentioned how South Australia was well placed to benefit from home builder because of the fact that house prices in SA, say, are a lot lower than they are in Melbourne and Sydney. Looking ahead, it'll be interesting to see how that affects the pattern of inward migration to Australia once migrants start coming back to Australia in larger numbers. Adelaide will be placed quite well, I think, when it comes to people's decisions about where to live, because if I was living overseas at the moment and I'm thinking of making the move to Oz, I'd be looking at Sydney, where the typical house price is well over 1.2, 1.3 million. Melbourne isn't a whole lot far behind that either. But Adelaide compares very favourably for people when it comes to housing costs. We reckon that most of the people who do arrive in Australia for the first time rent their accommodation for a while. I know I did anyway when I came here back 10 years ago. And it's likely that when people do weigh up the pros and cons of different parts of the market, that Adelaide will compare quite well, especially in terms of housing costs. And that might be another pillar of support going forward for demand for not just home building in SA, but all sorts of building in SA, because a growing population, as we know, benefits all sorts of services like health, education, retail, all those things when we get a bigger population, we need more of those buildings. And SA, from the point of view of its competitiveness, compares very well with some of the other bigger East Coast cities, I would say.
Absolutely. I want to turn now to non-residential building. I think we were very fortunate in South Australia that at the height of COVID uncertainty and private investment jitters, we had a very significant education capital works program from the government here. And that really kind of kept the industry going through probably the worst of COVID uncertainty. And then, that as things started to improve and private investment came back, I think we were placed pretty well to get through what was otherwise going to be a very challenging time. So I think we're quite fortunate that we had that program locked in from a couple of years ago, where the bulk of the work was really going on at that very critical time.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're dead right. We were worried about residential building this time 2 years ago, but we were even more worried about non-residential building. When the pandemic broke out back in February, March of 2020. In the case of South Australia, you're right. Yeah, it's held up really well, which is good. We were lucky with the timing, perhaps, of the educational investments that you mentioned. What we also had in our favour in SA was the fact that interest rates were low, as they were everywhere, but the figures were pretty good across the board. If you look at the different things that make up non-residential building activity, we have, it's kind of generally divided into three sort of subcategories. One of them relates to what we call kind of retail commercial, which includes offices, shops, etc. We have industrial, which is warehouses and factories and so on. And then the biggest and the most important part of non-residential is what we call kind of social, recreational and cultural buildings. That's your schools, it's your hospitals. It's also things like hotels, restaurants, pubs, museums, tourist facilities. That, as you say, stood up quite well. We had major education expenditures. There were some important projects being rolled out at that time as well when it came to health, the Adelaide Hospital being probably the most prominent example of that. But on the flip side then, of course, anything related to tourism was really very difficult to justify. And that part of activity did suffer on that front during the pandemic. The figures we're seeing show that the sort of public sector driven amount of non-residential building activity in SA is cooling off a little bit now, but better to be having a cool off now than cool off 2 years ago. What we will expect to see there is we expect a reasonably favourable outlook. We think that in some sectors, the sort of entertainment, recreation, tourism sectors, we reckon that the return to normality, which is kind of underway at the moment, we reckon that that will prop up and boost activity in certain parts of that segment of non-residential buildings. So we can look forward perhaps to more hotels and things getting off the ground as we move forward. If we switch back then to what I call retail commercial, again, which is your shops and offices basically, that held up much, much better than expected, even through the pandemic. A lot of people were predicting that, the pandemic would mean the end for office building projects, but that didn't actually really happen. There was a bit of a dip, but that dip now seems to be over, and the amount of office building project work is starting to grow again. As SA holds on to more people, we hope over the next few years, as it holds on to more of its own people over the next few years, and as inward migration returns to the SA economy, just the number of workers that will need office space will go up as well. It's worth saying, of course, that the way in which sort of jobs growth in office-based sectors translates into office building work will be weaker than it was before the pandemic. So 5 years ago, every 100 office workers would have needed 100 workspaces. Today, it'll be something more like every 100 office workers might need maybe 75 office spaces, because people realize that workers aren't always in the office now, all at the same time. And people can get away with providing less office space for their employees than before. So there will be a sort of a weakness to the degree in which jobs growth actually translates into office building growth over the years ahead. So that is something to watch. But as I say, SA's population growth did a bit better than most parts of Australia during the pandemic. I think part of that, as I say, was because people weren't leaving South Australia anymore for other states. And that was a good thing to see. And when you do have a population which is growing, and we're going to see an acceleration of that over the months and years ahead, as that starts to unfold, then we will get more demand for just about everything. The other thing I'll mention about non-residential building is industrial building, because industrial building is one of those things that had been in sort of long-term decline, for 15, 20 years. People were saying, oh, what's the point of building factories and warehouses anymore, because nothing ever gets made in Australia anymore. Total change there, total change since the pandemic. Industrial building work has taken off like a rocket. A few reasons behind that. People have realized that completely relying on overseas for your production, your distribution, and your supply chains isn't a good idea anymore. People want to be able to store stuff and make stuff here in Australia in case, for whatever reason, our international supply lines break down, as they did during the pandemic and as they have for other reasons more recently. We also have a kind of a boom in some sectors, agriculture and aquaculture, which I understand is important in parts of regional South Australia. Both of those building sectors are doing pretty well at the moment. And again, as I say, people are much more keen to have a deeper storage capacity close to where their customers are now. And for that reason, we're seeing much stronger building activity when it comes to things like warehouses. So that's another area of activity that's likely to remain strong over the foreseeable future on the non-residential building front, we think.
Shane, just on supply, it's obviously a massive issue facing the industry right now. And, the associated price increases we've seen, here in South Australia, the media is taking a real interest in timber, which is obviously important, but it's pretty much right across the board, isn't it, at the moment? When do you see, it's a question I get asked a lot, when do you see these supply challenges and these rapidly escalating price increases cooling off?
Yeah, good question, Will. This is obviously a huge issue. It's probably the single biggest issue that our industry faces at the moment. In other words, being able to access quality raw materials to build with at the right time, in the right place, on reasonable terms. The shortages we've been hit by, it's not just an Australian problem, it's a global problem. Because of what governments have done during the pandemic, they've tried to get their economies back on their feet all at the same time. They've cut interest rates to very, very minimal levels. They've pumped lots of money into the economy. And building work right across the globe has responded very favorably to those interventions by government. The problem, of course, is that everybody wants building materials all at the same time now. In the past, when Australia hasn't been able to meet its own demand for things like timber or steel in the past, we've just imported the deficit from overseas. That's become much more difficult. And as you say, for people at the coalface working in the building industry, we're looking at very large price increases for structural timber, structural steel, and other products as well, things like copper, aluminium, windows, door frames, all of that, huge price rises. It's also not just a case of price rises, but a case of not being able to get it in good time. In other words, you're getting delays of a month or two when you want to get stuff onto site. And you also have the sort of other unfavorable elements to the supply chain, such as suppliers only accepting minimum order sizes above a certain amount of money, like say $250,000 or whatever. So it's a very challenging situation. And when is it going to end? It's quite hard to say, given that we've sort of passed the big hump created by home builder. That is something that might favor things getting better over the next year or so. But what we've also had happening is when prices of commodities rise a lot, as they have done, some people sort of use them as a bargaining chip or a kind of a gambling token almost. They buy them up just to hope for more price rises and hope to sell them at a profit later. That basically leads to people hoarding those products. And I suspect a lot of that product right around the globe at the moment is simply being hoarded rather than used for anything actual beneficial to anybody. But we also then have recent developments around Ukraine, Russia. Whenever things like that happen, whenever we have a war or a geopolitical crisis like that, people pour money into commodities. They buy them up because they think that the price is going to keep rising. And invariably that brings about the price rises which were anticipated in the first place. I do reckon that given that we're moving in over the short term, at least, given that we're moving into a lower level of activity, at least here in Australia at the moment, and given that here and in other places, sort of people have made more of an effort to increase the supplies of all of the stuff that we've been running short of, I do reckon that those two effects will probably combine over the next while to cause prices to start decelerating again. And hopefully once that deceleration of prices gets underway, the hoarders and the speculators then will realize that the game is up, and then they will release the stuff they've been hoarding onto the market, which will mean even more supply again. It's tricky though, it's very tricky because, you know, if you look at timber, how do you get more timber? Grow more trees, yeah, but it takes, you know, 15, 20 years for that to reach a stage of maturity where it's something that can be actually used properly in building. So that makes a difficulty. So it's a tricky one. You know, we have tried to have interventions whereby the government has accessed product which is in places which wouldn't normally be commercially viable. Like, for example, some of the steel mills in New South Wales here on the East Coast were in areas affected by bushfires, and what the federal government, or what the New South Wales state government has tried to do, is they've tried to pay a transport subsidy so that logs can be brought in to the steel mill, or to the timber mills which were affected by bushfires, so that they can then be processed and used more quickly. And there's a kind of a rule of thumb here that says anything that's about more than 150 k's from a timber mill is not commercially viable. So the government over this side of the country has tried to some degree to tilt the balance in a way that makes more of the timber commercially viable than before. But again, these interventions, they help a little bit, but they're not going to be able to address the big problem. And I suppose the real issue, looking long term, in other words, if we want to avoid a problem like this happening again in the future, what do we have to do? I think we probably just have to look more carefully at our own timber plantation long-term strategy, ensure that we do grow enough. We've been telling the federal government that they have responded with an initiative to boost the amount of timber which we grow. But again, this is something that will only benefit us really over the long term. It's not something that's going to solve the problem we have at the minute.
You spoke about that timber transport subsidy. We've got something similar in South Australia, and the plan was that, well, Master Builders put a plan to our state government a year ago regarding Kangaroo Island timber, where there was about 300,000 tonnes of structural grade timber over there. Obviously, getting it off an island with a lack of adequate port infrastructure has been an issue, but that's where some funding has been made available. But an issue we've had is that the mills were at full capacity, with the exception of one mill in the state's mid-north that had never processed structural timber before. So we've had a situation where the logs have actually come off with this government subsidy off Kangaroo Island to this mill in the state's mid-north, which is a considerable distance away, but they're just sitting out there in the yard because there's no proper equipment to process it, which is just very frustrating for us. There's a few thousand tonnes sitting out there, so they're the type of things that make you pull your hair out, to be honest.
Yeah, it does, and it just goes to show how difficult it is when you do run out of something fundamental like timber, or run out of steel, because there's very few alternatives you can actually do to cope with the problem. It's hard to switch. You know, there are some builders who kind of here on the East Coast, especially in the Hunter region, up by Newcastle and around there, who use steel framing when they're building houses rather than timber. But again, it's not something you can switch to. You know, you can't stop working with timber on Friday and start with steel on Monday morning. It just doesn't work that way. And I think, you know, the experience of the Kangaroo Island just goes to show how difficult it can be to switch from one thing to another. There's lots of barriers in the way. And that's why we do have to think long term in terms of avoiding a situation like this again.
Absolutely. Shane, you spoke about the inflationary pressures before. Regarding interest rates, they're obviously very important for our industry. Where do you see interest rates going over both the short and medium terms? Interest rates
is, you know, on New Year's Day, I think the big question everybody had was, is 2022 going to be the year that interest rates finally start going up? Interest rates, believe it or not, in Australia haven't risen since 2010, I believe. So that's now 12 years ago, which is an incredibly long time to go without an RBA interest rate increase. The RBA really it doesn't have a fixed plan about whether or not interest rates will go up during 2022. It really does depend on what conditions are. The RBA's biggest nightmare for the economy will be if an inflationary spiral takes hold. This would be a situation where the price of stuff in shops and the price of stuff around retail and utilities and the stuff we use every day in our homes, if the price of that starts growing too quickly, that becomes a really difficult situation for an economy to handle, because what happens is that the price increases start to spiral and escalate. And when people see the price of things increasing in the shops, and when they see the price of their energy bills going up, sooner or later it leads to wages in the economy going up again. And when wages go up, companies then have to increase their prices again, and you can get into a situation where the inflation rate, it might get to 3%, 4%, 5%, and it'll just keep getting higher and higher and higher. And everybody will then start building in sort of last year's inflation rate into the pricing that they do next year, and it becomes very, very difficult to eliminate without pain. The RBA's strategy on this is to get the pain over with early. If they think that the inflation that we're seeing around the world at the moment is becoming dangerously built in to what people are doing in terms of their price setting for people that run businesses or for workers who receive a wage and an income from their employers. If the RBA thinks that people are starting to push for higher wages, then I think they'll be forced to intervene, put interest rates up, take money out of the economy, give people a bit of pain in their pockets, so that the inflationary demand pressures from the economy are loosened a little bit. Inflation rate here at the moment, it's 3.5%. The expectation had been that it would fall back again. That seems a little bit less certain now because of the energy price increases that have resulted from the Russia-Ukraine situation. Wages across the Australian economy at the minute don't seem to be growing all that high. And until there's sort of strong evidence that the price pressures are actually leading to people receiving and demanding higher wages, the RBA won't intervene. But if they get to a situation whereby people are looking for higher wages and getting higher wages, then I think they'll intervene very quickly and decisively and put interest rates up to make sure that things don't start getting out of control. And the chances of that happening this year, much higher than it was a month ago, I would say. It does depend a lot on what we see in the energy markets, and it does also depend, as I say, on what happens in the millions of workplaces around Australia in terms of what employees and employers agree in terms of wages.
Well, Shane, as I said at the start of this podcast, forecasting is always tricky, but it must have been next level over the past 2 years. But I think you've done a great job. I know I find you a very valuable resource to call on at any time when I'm thinking about the outlook and stuff. So I appreciate your time coming in here today, Shane, and I think it will be of good value to our members who are tuning in. So thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Will. Thank you very much, and thank you very much everyone listening.
Thanks for joining me on Building Perspective. For more information on Master Builders or our guests, please visit our website at mbasa.com.au.